I'm going to start out with a little bit of Irish for those who are listening. Diadiv, Tashiga Josh Shiv Ekwal, is Misha Lorretta Lynde. You can see the writing on the page here, and what I just said was, hello, it is nice to see you. I am Lorretta Lynde. So you can see how different the Irish language can be. First of all, the Irish language is a Celtic language. It's a traditional language of Ireland, and it migrated to Scotland with the Gaels. The Gaels are often the group of people associated with the origins of the Gaelic branch of the Celtic languages. Today, there are 6 Celtic languages that remain. Includes Scottish Gaelic, Irish, which a lot of people like to call Irish Gaelic, and Welsh, Breton, Cornish, and Manx. If you're wondering why I have any background in this, I've been studying the language for about 12 years, maybe 13 years, and I have been to Ireland 15 times. Today, Irish is considered the first official language of Ireland, and that would be in the Republic of Ireland. There are 6 counties in the country of Ireland, which are actually Britain. They're up in the north, and that's when you talk about Northern Ireland. But when the Republic of Ireland, the other counties, gained their freedom from Britain, they wanted to preserve the language, so they made it the official language of the country. It has a dominant position in any government documents. It's not spoken as a first language by most Irish people, but most Irish people have a good working knowledge of it, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. Gaelic itself came from a language spoken by people called the Gaels, as I mentioned before. They came from the northern part of Ireland first when they came into the country, and then on down south. And some of the language is rooted in what you might call the Celtic language. And it goes back maybe as far as 1500 BC in the area of Ireland. Oddly, and this will surprise almost anybody who hears it, Gaelic is Indo-European and is most closely related to Sanskrit. So it's kind of not what you would expect for a language that would be spoken in Europe. It's also a language of invaders, because Ireland and Scotland and a lot of the other areas there were invaded many times by all sorts of other nationalities or ethnic groups. So a good example I can give you is the Vikings were very commonly involved in invading Ireland. They came many times. And anything relating to seafaring, words for boat and for the ocean and for navigation, will have its roots actually in the Viking language. It's obviously been modified to some extent to sound more like what the rest of Irish sounds like, but it's important that we know some of these languages came from other areas. And when the Catholic monks came, a lot of Latin came into the language, but again, altered to sound more like Irish. It didn't become a written language for a long, long time. The earliest written part of the language turns up in about the 3rd or 4th century AD, and that's when the monks came. Their language was different, and I'll talk about that just in a second here. The English word for the Irish language is Irish. So if somebody says Irish Gaelic, that's kind of a English adaptation. The Irish word for the language is Gaelga. You can look at that pronunciation and wonder why it's like that, rather than Gaelic. So if somebody's talking about Gaelga, that is the Irish language, but that is actually the Irish word for it. A lot of people think, oh, well, if you're talking about Irish, you just must be talking about the brogue, but it's a completely separate language, and we're going to learn a little bit about its origins. The very first examples of the written Irish language are a writing style known as Ogham. And Ogham Again, take a look at that word and know that the pronunciation is completely different from how it looks. Ogham is a series of 20 symbols, usually slashed on a rock or a stone like this one that you see in the picture here. And it's always written vertically down a vertical line. So you'll see the horizontal slashes. They may either be slanted or parallel strokes of a very horizontal. I thought this was one of the really good pictures to show you how it looks when you just stumble across it in the Irish countryside. It's usually carved on stones. There are a significant number of these stones still in Ireland, and generally they seem to carry the names of people and maybe were used at one time to indicate the edges of or the borders of somebody's property or somebody's kingdom. Old Irish was first translated into words on paper by the early Christian monks. They were the first ones who came and actually had writing. They brought some Latin into the language, but again, it was altered to sound more like Irish. So, and by the way, any of you who are muted now, if you have questions as I go, it's fine with me, if it's okay with Michelle, for you to go ahead and unmute and just ask the question, because a lot of times people don't remember what questions they want to ask at the end, and I'm pretty conversational, so I have no problem with somebody wanting to ask a question.
Yeah, that sounds great, Lorretta. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, just let me know that you're there and that you have a question. After the conversion to Christianity, Old Irish begins to appear in some of the margins of manuscripts that the monks were writing. And if you've ever seen old monastic manuscripts, they're very ornate. They usually have the written body of the Bible in the body of the text, but up and down the sides there may be decorations, and sometimes the decorations were Old Irish language instead. Early Irish comes after Old Irish, and it represented a transition between Middle and Modern Irish. This is confusing, but because of all the invasions, a lot of times there were big changes in the language. Its literary form, which basically is the edges of the Modern Irish, began to be used by writers in both Ireland and Scotland until around the 18th century or so. And then it got modernized again to the form what you'll see today. There's a couple of oddities about it, but until the 19th century, most people in Ireland spoke Irish, but that changed in 1801 or after 1801 when Ireland was conquered by the United Kingdom, or in those days, just Britain. The British made it illegal to write in the language, read in the language, and generally to speak the language. It was very much like our Native Americans here. It was kind of punishable by even imprisonment and some other harsh punishments. Some of the Irish leaders felt it was good to shift over to English because that would be the language of business that they would be able to do, and maybe that would make it easier on the people. Because of this, a lot of the Irish had to hide the fact they were being educated, and they had to hide the fact that they were worshiping in the old Catholic religion because the British wanted them to belong to the Church of England. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Irish has continued to survive in what we call Gaeltacht regions, and you'll see the migration of those a little bit later on. But in the meantime, the Gaeltacht that do exist, these are little tiny parts of Ireland that still are using Irish as their primary language. If you look on the left side of the screen, you'll see that all of the signage for roads and on the bridge there are purely in Irish. There is no English on there. When you get into the rest of Ireland, you see Irish is the first language on most of the road signs, and then the English translation of that is right underneath. And it's the more bold-faced one for tourists like you and me, and for those Irish who speak mostly English. So that's been their their nod to the fact that it is still the official language of the country. Now, some oddities about the language itself. It has only 18 letters in the alphabet as opposed to our 26. So you'll see the letters that do exist in green, and missing are J and K and Q and V, W, X, Y, and Z. Sounds that would be made by those missing letters are made instead by combinations of letters. And I give you an example here. BHFUIL is pronounced will. Makes all the sense in the world, right? Everybody should be able to tell that after all. We talked the other day a little bit as we were doing the setup for this about Irish names that confuse people. And I thought they were a good way to show how combinations of letters are used to make sounds that you would not expect. And by the way, the little accent marks over certain letters are there to tell you which way to pronounce those vowels. They only show up over vowels and they do affect the pronunciation. The top 5 names here are men's names. The first one is Quiveen, second, Padraig, Rory, Seamus, and Sean. Below that are 5 women's names: Aoife, Cuifa, Niamh, Roisin, and Saoirse. I want to go back up to Padraig for a moment because we all know about St. Patrick's Day, and some of us want to say St. Patty's Day with T's. It's not St. Patty's Day, it is St. Paddy's Day. And the reason is, there's your original name in Irish. It's a D, not a T. So there's a little cultural moment for you there. For years, Irish was not popular in Northern Ireland. And the reason again being that remained British when the independence was gained by the Republic of Ireland. But now it's beginning to be learned. Another oddity in the language is that it has no yes or no. Instead, questions are answered with a part of the question. For example, are you going home? The answer would be, I am going home. I am not going home. It wouldn't be yes or no. There are no words in the Irish language for yes or no. So that's another oddity and a formality, if you will. The word order is different too. It makes people sound a little bit like Yoda, if any of you are familiar with Star Wars. It has a verb, subject, and object order. So I saw a bird would be saw I a bird. Sounds a lot like Yoda. Speak I Irish. That would be the literal translation. And you have to remember that word order makes it something that is awkward for those of us who speak English. The words for numbers are interesting as well because, well, we have two.
Sorry, Lorretta, you're kind of in between pages there
Yeah,
on the.
Yeah, that's intentional, but that's.
Oh, okay.
The words for numbers are also a little bit different than what we would have in English, but not as different as you might think. We have 2 sets of words for numbers in English. We either have the straightaway numbers 1, 2, 3, and then the second set of words we use for numbers are first, second, third. But Irish adds in another one for when you're counting people. So they have 3 forms of words for depending upon what you are counting. And so that makes a very different, and they have enough of a different sound that, again, if you were trying to speak this language in Ireland, you need to know that because to the Irish ear, it would sound foreign. I'll give you an example of it. 5 children is cuigar, pashti, but 5 horses would be cuig, couple, for the 5 horses. So they do have a different sound. it just adds another layer in there. And the beginnings of the words will change too, depending on their grammatical environment. In other words, if you're talking about something or someone female, the kinds of beginnings of those words would be different than if you're talking about a person, or they also have some of their objects that have gender as well. So it can be very confusing, and yet it's more reliable in many ways than English. Our language is very, very confusing to people trying to learn it as a second language. So we shouldn't be too shocked when we see another language that's complicated. Does anybody have any questions or comments or curiosities at this point? I'm happy to answer anything as we're going along.
No, you're doing a great job, just mind-boggling on my part.
Well, it's one of those things where we don't think about it because they tend to speak English most of the time. Our assumption is that everything that they say is going to be just like we do it. But even in their own language, you'll find that it exists in different forms. And I'll address that when I talk a little bit more about how some of that has come to be. In many parts of Ireland, their English will show a parallel structure. The fun thing is that when the Irish emigrated to America, mostly in the 1840s and 50s because of the big famine, they brought some of those quirks with them, and we use them every day without even knowing we have. It's one of those things that I think is really fun because I search for it now that I've been studying the language over time. And it definitely shows up in Butte, by the way, and I'll give you some examples of that in a minute because it's really kind of funny. But some of the words that you might guess came from Irish and ended up in the English language are words like shamrock or malarkey or shenanigan or smithereens. But words you might not guess are words like to brag, which comes from the Irish word brag, B-R-E with a little slash over the top, A-G, which is a lie or an exaggeration. The word slew, a whole slew of things, comes from the Irish word slua, which means a large number or a host of things. Sneak, shnee, to creep or to crawl. Galore is a lot. It means a lot, just the way it's spelled there, G-O, and then the second word, L-E-O-R, means a lot. And knick-knack, which is a curiosity or something that's unusual. So these things have crept into our language over time. And one of the really fun things is because there was such an intense migration to Butte of Irish people, there are things that turn up. My favorite, of course, is use guys. Because in English, we have only one word for you, whether it's one you or 3 or 4 you. The plural of you in Irish is a completely separate word. So in order to designate that in English, it just evolved that if it's one person, it's you in Butte, but if it's a collection of you, it's going to be use. If any of you have been in Butte at any time, you'll pick that up. You'll hear the real Butte natives almost all say, you know, what are you guys doing tonight? What would you just like for lunch? There's always that little S on the end of the Y-O-U. So it crept into our language. There's so much of it. I thought about making a big list of it. And I just decided these were little examples that would be a little startling and make you say, well, I wonder what other ones, and maybe you look into that. Even though all the Irish people are pretty much speaking English, and of course television has contributed to that, and the fact that it is the language of business, and being the good hosts that Irish are, they definitely lean toward using English if a tourist is in or in their shop or whatever. But they all the people in the Republic of Ireland, whether you're in elementary school or high school, you are expected to have a working knowledge and a speaking knowledge of the language. All teachers have to be fluent and able to teach the language. So that's part of their getting their teacher certification. It's an expected thing that they will be able to speak Irish fluently. And it's really interesting because I've been to, I have to say, 3 immersion programs in Ireland where I went over just to learn the language. And since they were in the summer, almost every single time, we had lots and lots of Irish teachers in those classes. But they're like so many of us in America where we take algebra and then we get out of school and we say, I'm never using that again. There's no use for it. A lot of Irish speaking students do the same when they get out of school. And it's kind of sad because they all have beautiful pronunciation and they all know the meanings of the words, but they don't use it as a basic language like you would hope that they would. There are schools though now in Ireland, and I'm not sure when they began. I wish I could tell you exactly when they began, that are complete immersion schools. They're called national schools, and parents choose them more often because of cultural identity. They send their kids there and the kids learn entirely in Irish, whether it's their math class or their history class or any other class that the kid might be taking. It's going to be taught in Irish, and the child is expected to learn to speak fluent Irish. So there's more migration toward that. And in kind of a funny underlayment, it's become sort of a fashionable thing to do in Northern Ireland, where for years it was kind of brushed off and thought, that's not important. Now it has become a thing to know how to do. So we're seeing more being taught in schools, more being taught in out of school classes. And that's been a really kind of a hopeful thing for the preservation of the language. It's rare when you see this, the Irish being the official language of the country, and yet it's an endangered language because it has been declining. So it's really exciting to see it now start to come back into its own. Many Irish will tell you that they speak Irish and they turn up that way in the national census. It is the first official language, as I noted before, and the government has supported the language in many ways. There is actually a law on the books to increase the level of public services signage, as I showed you on the road signs and all of that, and make sure that they are delivered both in Irish, actually in Irish first, and then secondly in English. And I noticed it in particular flying over once on the Irish airline, Aer Lingus. The captain's first announcements are made in Irish, and then he goes back and makes them in English. So that's probably under this Irish language law. They do have television stations and radio stations that are all Irish speaking programs, and that's helpful for people who want to keep their Irish from getting too rusty. There are about, I'd have to say about 3 million people in Ireland now, and out of that approximately 1,700,000 speak Irish fluently enough, but only about 140,000 of them are native speakers. In other words, their parents were raised in households where that was the first language, and they raised their kids in households where that was the first language. And only about 82,000 of all of those people speak it on a daily basis outside of school. But another piece of the preservation of the language is that it has spread out into other countries. You can find an Irish language class almost anywhere. In fact, there is one taught in conjunction with Carroll College here by a very good teacher. And there's an Irish studies program that has a expanded Irish language program over in Missoula. And then you'll find it in really strange places like maybe China, maybe Germany. There's been a fascination, probably because of the huge outmigration of people. 2 million migrated out during the famine, and they took their language with them. And so there's a lot of descendants who say, gee, I think I'd really like to learn the language. Probably a good 2/3 of them take one class and say, oh my God. As Dave was saying, it's mind-boggling when you see how complicated it is. But there is a certain logic to it too. If you're really determined to learn it, you can learn it for sure. It used to be one of the main languages of Newfoundland, Canada, because that was where a huge number of Irish landed and stayed. And if you've ever visited that area, you can see why, because it looks just like Ireland. It's got the Northern Atlantic, it's got the sea there, the seafaring and fishing industries, and it's just culturally very similar to Ireland itself. But it has, the language itself died out to some extent by the 19th century, and it left traces in the local dialect, just like what we were talking about with English. Another place where Irish has been paramount, really super important, is it is a literary language. There are so many brilliant authors who have written both in English and Irish, and that is the style of their writing. It's a rich language. I want to give you a little piece of that too, because it's something that we are a real cut and dried language in English, and in order to make it descriptive, we have to use a lot of words. But an example that always strikes me is that emotions in Ireland are expressed, in Irish, are expressed in a very picturesque way. So if I say that I'm happy, that's the American way we would say it, I'm happy. In Irish, you will say ta ahas orum, which means happiness is on me, like I'm wearing my happiness. And that's so much richer than how we express it. We expect everybody else to just kind of interpret what we're saying and read how happy we are when we say I'm happy. But emotions are expressed that way in Irish, and you really, really get the feeling of it. It's got a real striking sense of the emotion.
Maybe that's why that there's quite a few poems written by the Irish, and some of them, or quite a bit of them, I guess, was set to music.
Yes, music is a huge piece, but the language itself is very musical. So, you know, it was kind of a natural transition, I think. There isn't a person I know who grew up in Ireland who wasn't expected to learn to sing, whether they sang well or not. And most of them do, by the way. It's makes me ashamed of myself. And where I always smile is that if the relatives came over for, pick a holiday, Christmas, the kids are expected to have a song or a little ditty for them, and it's called their party piece, which again, very descriptive. I love it. I think it makes it fun, and maybe that's part of why they do that. So that it's music is a piece of the. I kind of almost feel like it's a teeter-totter where it's either the language or music or both, because they just go back and forth or up and down. So yeah, a good observation, Dave, but there's also huge amounts of good literature, novels, that sort of thing. And then the Irish had a gigantic verbal tradition, oral tradition, if you will, before written language, of all of this mythology and legend. And all of that has been written down in later years. And again, in this just beautiful linguistic style. So it's very it's very a literary type language. And, you know, you start to think back again, the people you don't necessarily recognize as being Irish, but they were very Irish. People like James Joyce, George Bernard Shaw, whether it's drama, whether it's novels, whether it's poetry, just beautiful, beautiful stuff because the language is so rich. And a lot of it, not all of it, but a good part of it may have been written in Irish before it was translated into English. So, any other observations or questions there about the literary part? Well, when I was talking about it being an endangered language, I want to show you how it has shrunk. In 1800, before the invasion and conquering by Britain, the far left map, those of you who can see it, that's where there were native Irish speakers. As I described them before, they were raised in a home that spoke only Irish, and they carried that language with them. In 1850, when the famine was in its peak, you can see how many people either left or died or felt it was too dangerous to speak the language. And you can see it start to shrink. So that's the second one from the left over. And about 1900, there are these little patches of places that still have the native speakers. Some of them were probably the old people who were left over from, who didn't migrate and who didn't die during the famine. And then when you get into today, you see these tiny little green circles. And that's where there are what we call the Gaeltachts today. So if you're visiting Ireland and you happen to drive into one of those, you go back to that signage that I was talking about, it's all going to be in Irish. And I have to say that was where I first said, I want to learn this language, because I was so fascinated by how all those combinations of letters and how they came together to make sounds, and how I was supposed to interpret where the heck I was and what speed I should be going and whether I should yield right of way. Luckily, they use the same shape signs as we use for things like yield and stop. But if you didn't know that, I think you'd be a little confused. But that's their claim to fame, and they have a relationship with the government that's a little bit like our historic preservation relationships, that for sustaining the culture of the Gaeltachts, and they sustain the music, the dance, the language, and some of the other more artistic, maybe more craft type traditions. They have a probably what you might call a sort of a tax increment or a reward for that, for sustaining those areas. So we've gone from this huge, more than half of the country, down to those tiny little circles of population there, to look at what's left of true native Irish speaking areas. So I'm going to pause here. We're about 35 minutes in now, and I'd just like to be sure that I'm covering everything that any one of you might want to know. Any questions at all?
Well, sort of the observation, I suppose I've had my genealogy tested a couple of times, and sort of pops back and forth between the Irish and the Scottish. Sort of depends on which one I look at, which outfit. But in Ireland here, mine, one of the guesses that they come up with is that the south west end of Ireland. And the best I can figure out, that we came over probably just a little bit before the famine on it, probably about 1830, 35, sometime around in through there. And then about the western, I'm sorry, the eastern, it was the southeastern part, southwestern part, I'm sorry, gosh, And I'm about in the middle also of Ireland on the western side, and then a small, possibly one on the middle part of the eastern part was their best guesses of where the family might have come from. But I guess that all of the Irish and stuff and the good sentencing and everything else sort of just bounced right on over me and stuff on it. But I do remember that when I grew on up, we were sort of at the end of the time when people came to visit, that we had to play a little ditty on the piano, or when my sister took violin, she had to play a little bit, and pretty squeaky and stuff on there. We never went with it and stuff. That was, you know, basically before TV. And that's what you had mentioned something there. And I know that some of the relatives that lived out in the hills over in Oregon, when we went to visit them, that was very, very common and stuff on there, the singing and the evening time.
Yep. Yeah, there's, and I want to put your mind at ease a little bit about some of your genealogy, because a lot of people say, well, I'm only Scottish or I'm only Irish, but it, you know, whatever. And the thing that's fun about that is that the Irish were known as kind of a warrior people, and they invaded Scotland. That's where a lot of the genetics come from in Scotland. And the Irish or Gaelic word for, in one of their many words for invaders, is Scotty.
Now my granddad at one time said that we were Scottish Irish, and the reason I say that, I'm about 25% of one or the other, and then the rest of it is all over Europe, mostly Southern Europe, and a little bit of Norway, and I figure some of that came from the Vikings when they invaded.
Yep.
And I've gotten back. We had some pretty famous people, and there was lots of in the family tree that were written, and I've gotten on back to just about 1,000.
Oh, good job.
Yeah.
Hard to do with Irish, but if you had some Scottish,
Yeah.
the thing with the Scots is that they stayed, they converted more easily to the British rule. The Irish were a lot more resistant. Now we're seeing the Scots realize that they want away from that too. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, that's real common. And then the Scots Irish were often used. What they did is they called it, they planted them. So that's what they did with Northern Ireland, and why Northern Ireland did not ever declare independence from Britain. And then a bunch of them came to America and were planted by the British before full defeat by the Americans. So it is not uncommon to find those kinds of genetic things, and it's not uncommon to hear that descriptor Scots Irish. That's real common.
Yeah, I couldn't. I know that what was really interesting was that I mentioned to my mother that, you know, we were mostly Irish, and boy, she went through the roof. And I couldn't figure it. And I talked to my uncle, her brother, who's a little bit younger. I says, I don't know why she would do that and stuff on there, but I know that even back in her, you know, back in the early 1900s, the Irish were looked down upon.
Oh, yes.
On it. And I really kind of wondered if that wasn't something that was a kickback to that on there, was why she done it. And it's only been really, if they were smart enough, Irish were smart enough on it to become cops.
Yeah, there's a lot of history behind all of that. I could do a whole nother program on that.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things where they definitely were looked down upon, and that's what made Butte unique.
Yeah.
I would like to mention that is that for some, well, not for some reason, Marcus Daly brought Irish people to work in his mines here, And they were not repressed in Butte. They were allowed to be mayor if they wanted to be. That, you know, if they could run for mayor and get elected, nobody questioned that. And yes, they did become cops. They became soldiers very often in the cavalry when the
Yeah.
Indian Wars were on. So there's a huge gain over time. But the thing that always touches me is that when a lot of the Irish came, before there was Ellis Island, they came to all sorts of ports in America. And one of the big ports they came to was New Orleans, where the
Yeah.
only work they could find was things like digging ditches and whatnot. And
Yeah.
here's the kicker, Dave, just a minute. Here's the kicker. That was that they would be hired to do these horrible jobs in the swamps. And if they died of yellow fever, that was okay, because you could always get another Irishman, but slaves were expensive.
Yeah, no, I've read that also on it. And they got shipped there once in a while when they couldn't take them down to some of the islands in the Gulf there on it. No, it's really kind of amazing on there. And my aunt used to tell me stories in Butte there about the graft and stuff that went on between the cops and the mayors and everything else and stuff. You had to get there on it to make a living.
Well, it was clan stuff,
Yeah.
really. So anybody else have any questions? Because Dave and I are having a great conversation here, but I don't want to leave anybody else out. I'm going to be sure that if you have questions, you get them asked. Joyce or Samara or Michelle, any of you?
I'm doing good. This is great stuff.
Anything strike you as odd or?
So Loretta, when you mentioned that there's some national schools that are
Yes.
kind of trending now, is it more in one area or is it just kind of scattered all over?
It kind of scattered all over, and it took me a long time to get my head straight when I was over there, Samara. One of the things I thought was really interesting is their public schools, the kids wear uniforms. And the private schools, a lot of times they don't, which is just the opposite of what we do here in the States. That, but they're pretty intent on it. And it's just, I would say probably every county's got a few of those national schools.
You know, the wife, I got her over to Africa. They're doing some missionary work over the years. And one of the things that for the kids to go to school, they have to have a uniform. And a lot of that is so that there's no discrimination between the students, that all of them were dressed the same. Therefore, you couldn't tell the economical background of the families, although most of them were orphans.
Yeah, that's one of the advantages of uniforms almost everywhere, is that you don't have that differentiation. Any questions about the language, you guys? Great question, Samara. They are all over the place. And again, I think you're going to see more and more of them in Northern Ireland as well. I didn't choose to try to teach anybody anything in the Irish language because I don't know where you'd use it, for one thing. But the other thing that is fun is just some of the little sayings, and I'll teach all of you one thing that I think is way fun. All of you have probably heard top of the morning to you, right? There's an answer to that.
Yes.
The rest of the day to you.
That I hadn't heard.
Yeah. So if somebody says top of the morning to you, you can answer them that way, and you're in the groove.
Okay, well, Samara and I are in the office together. We'll start doing that now.
Yeah, there you go. Top of the morning to you. And the rest of the day to you. I think it's a lovely greeting. And again, thank you guys for having me. I thought we might have a few more questions because it's obviously clear as a bell. All you have to do is look at these signs and you know exactly what to say. I would mention one other things about the signage too. Here's a really good example of the British imposing their will. When they came over as the conquerors, they did all the mapping. And so they listened to the locals some of the time, and tried to interpret what they were hearing into the name of the place in English. And on the right, you'll see some of that. There's Corkig, which they said, oh, that must be Cork. The next one is Kinsale. And then the other one is a total interpretation, exactly right, for the Irish, which is Cuan on Yanov, which is Sandy Cove. Yanov is sandy, Cuan is cove. So that's a little bit of what you'll see. And once in a while, they were able to hold on to the name of the place completely, and other places they could not hang on, and we got names like Garrettstown, which is probably some famous Briton person who had something to do with government or whatever, or maybe he was one of the lords that had one of the estates. But you'll see some of that as well. So this has been a pleasure, you guys. It's really been fun.
I got the Muck MC on the first of the names. Now I heard that meant son of, and then the last name or the first name of the person is that something that you've heard? Or?
Well, absolutely, because the word for son in Irish is mac.
Okay, is that M-A-C?
If you said my son, you'd say my, you change the front pronunciation of it, but it's spelled M-H. You'd say Mawak and M-H-A-C. That's how you say son.
Oh, okay. So I know you in Scotland then on it, most of them is M-A-C.
Yeah.
And then over in Ireland, we're MC.
Or some of both, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know they used to have telephone books online several years ago. Then they took them down for some reason on it. But when I was first looking around for maybe where, if we came from Ireland or Scotland on there, that I looked, and then our name is McFerrin.
Okay.
And I think in Scotland there was two listings, phone number listings and stuff. Then I went over and in Ireland and looked at theirs, and there was at least 3 or 4 pages of McFerrins. And so that's why that I've always sort of leaned towards the family coming from Ireland instead of Scotland.
Yeah, and they may have come from Ireland by way of Scotland. A lot of times, if there was no work in Ireland, they would go to England or Scotland for work.
Yeah, there was one that appeared that happened, and it was on the west coast of Scotland, on up towards the north, and they had taken a ship on it, came to America on it, and that was sometime around the late 1800s that I was able to discover that. But
yeah,
the stuff comes and goes on there, boy. I'm not very good at keeping notes.
Well, for what it's worth, neither were the Irish. That's why it's kind of hard to research it sometimes. They either didn't keep records, or the records were burned or destroyed in various raids and in invasions of various kinds. So
yeah, there was quite a few churches and stuff that they went in and got the gold and stuff there for the
destroyed them completely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of that.
I was curious about like the islands off of the coast. Like, were they more like, what's their culture like compared to like mainland, or like was that more Gaelic speakers there?
Yes, they were a little safer. It was a little bit more, and you'll notice that even on the coastal, all these little circles here, they're all kind of remote and kind of tucked away. In many cases for the British, it wasn't worth it. They just, it's not worth it to go over there and try to stop them from that. So those were the places where the culture and the language survived a lot better because of that.
Mhm.
So yeah, there's so many little factors that play in. I want to point out one, if you can see my pointer. Can you guys all see my
Yeah.
pointer?
Yeah.
This area right down in here is where most of the Butte people came from.
Ah,
And it was a copper mining region. So when Marcus Daly got his mines going here in Butte, he said, I know where there are people who have the skill to do this already. And he sent for those people, and they sent for their brothers, and they sent for their uncles and sons. And so you'll see a lot of names that are purely from that area, like Sullivan is a really common one. And
Yeah.
Harrington, both Sullivan and Harrington, big names in what is known as the Barrow Peninsula there.
I'll be darned. Yeah, there was two houses, two neighbors right next to my aunt's place there in Butte. It was Sullivan's.
You bet. Lots of it. So any other questions from anybody? Michelle, Joyce, either one of you?
I don't think so. We sure have enjoyed your presentation, though, Lorretta, and we're very thankful to you for joining us today. And maybe we can schedule you for something else down the road a little bit.
You guys are more than welcome. It's always fun to talk about these kinds of things. And if it's something I'm this familiar with, I'm really comfortable. I can just converse about it. Don't expect me to have expertise in some areas, but this is one. And I've got 8 million pretty pictures of Ireland if you ever want just to talk about Ireland.
Oh, that sounds like a great presentation.
Yeah.
So there's that's certainly doable.
Yeah,
So thanks for being such a good audience and for listening so intently. I usually have lots more questions, but maybe I was just really articulate this time.
Well, that was very wonderful, Lorretta. Again, thank you so much. And we'll definitely be in touch for maybe scheduling me again.
Okay, anytime, you guys.
All righty.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.